Season 2 of the Behind the Mask podcast is proudly supported by Chemist Warehouse. Here at Behind the Mask, we acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are the original storytellers and custodians of the land on which we live and meet today. Behind the Mask is a podcast about sharing authentic stories. And in continuing that legacy of storytelling, we acknowledge that we're honouring and celebrating Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' traditions, customs and stories. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
To me, perfection is death. Perfection is the end. It's a completion of a cycle. So for me, if we're aiming at perfection, we're actually headed towards our own death or a death of something, right? Because we're never going to actually arrive at perfection until that point.
I'm obsessed by play. I think as humans, we're not playing. Right? We don't understand the power of experimentation and imagination as adults in the real time. Shit's just happened to me. Okay, what do I do now? Ask myself a question. How do I get through that? Right? Who can help me? And as soon as you ask that question, you take agency back. So the conditions of your life don't determine your attitude. You've just literally asked yourself a question. You've got more skin in the game, literally by tapping into the play state.
The death practice, for me, a really nice one is to actually make your own funeral playlist. The gentle invitation there is notice what happens. You really start thinking about your life. If you've got to distill it down to a soundtrack of 4 songs, and then you're starting to have these conversations with yourself about why that song, what does it mean? It starts to be a really deeply internal process.
Imposter syndrome I carry it around every minute because both, my brother's a doctor, my other brother's a PhD in microsurgery. I'm failing year 11 maths, and inadvertently you get put into these scenarios where you go, why the hell am I here? And can I actually do this? And even when I was working with, Ash Barty in the early days or Richmond, I was thinking, is this actually going to work? Am I full of shit?
I'm Josh Pitterman and welcome to Season 2 of the Behind the Mask podcast. This show is about our diverse and extraordinary guests whose authentic stories have challenged them and changed them. They'll share the tools and wisdoms they use to find purpose, bliss, and a greater sense of meaning to their lives. And together, we'll unpack and ponder some of the more pressing and existential issues facing our society. Get ready to be inspired by the depths of the human experience. It's time to go behind the mask. Welcome to this week's episode of the Behind the Mask podcast, featuring Ben Crowe from Mojo Crowe and Ash Packman from The Fifth Direction. Now, these are two of the wisest dudes I know, and they did not let me down. The chats were absolutely epic. They literally blew my mind. It felt like we were chatting for like 10 or 15 minutes. It ended up going for well over 2 hours. And because of that, we've decided to split it over 2 episodes. So let's get cracking with part 1. Ben Crowe is one of the world's most acclaimed and respected mindset coaches. His organisation, Mojo Crowe, empowers everyone from athletes to performers to world leaders to CEOs to look inward and ask themselves 3 simple yet equally very challenging questions. Who am I? What do I want? How do I get there? Ash Packman is the former president of Meditation Australia and the founder of The Fifth Direction, which uses breathwork, meditation, poetry, and storytelling to also ask people to look inward, to help them reclaim their mythic imagination and celebrate a return to soul. Apart from my father, these 2 men have had the most profound impact on my life. They have been sensational role models, and their lessons and teachings and wisdoms have shaped me in ways that are sort of immeasurable, but I notice them each and every day in my daily actions and my behaviours. I'm eternally grateful for our paths intersecting. In different ways and in different times, they've both shared with me one of the most profound roadmaps for understanding a part of the human experience. And I don't feel like I could be sitting around a safer, wiser, or more open table to discuss that very theory today. So it's time to go behind the mask and take a very deep dive into Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. So I am joined today in the Roland Media Studio by these two great men, Ash Packman and Ben Crowe. Welcome to Behind the Mask, gents.
Wow, thank you, Josh. That was an incredible opening, by the way. You didn't read that, did you? That was just straight off the cuff.
You remember the time I went to drama school?
Yeah. That's pretty cool. Yeah, okay.
I can learn scripts and stuff.
No, thank you very much. And to be frank, when Josh told me that I was doing this podcast with you, Ash, I asked him, can this be a live therapy session? Because when he explained what you do, I was like, there is so much that I don't know about certain areas, especially around spirituality and especially around soul. And there's also so much that I need on a personal level. So I'm not kidding. I'm going to be asking you as many questions as Josh is going to be asking us, right? Because, yeah, it's a privilege to be here, and it's a privilege to be here amongst both of you as well.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. Your names are mentioned more than anyone else's names on this potty. So expectations are high. It's like Christmas for our producer, Braden. We've both been pumped for this. We talk a lot about pressure, Ben, and dealing with pressure. Mate, the pressure's on you now. Yeah, it's big pressure.
I'm very happy you've launched with that. Both those words, expectations and pressure, they're both my favourite words. And just coming off the Olympics, right? And I was asked recently publicly why Australia performed so well. And one of the reasons, in my opinion, was our chef de mission decided not to put these expectations out there of a certain amount of medals. She wanted them to be intrinsically motivated, just to compete, have fun, and play. They still had goals and dreams, obviously, whether it might be a PB or a gold medal. But they just knew they could separate what was the goal from what was expected of them.
Yeah.
Because there's no guarantees, obviously, when you're competing in anything. But most people don't realise that, and I've never seen so much pressure in the world today. And there's two types of pressure. There's emotional pressure, which is typically expectations of others, or this feeling that you have to live up to someone else's expectations or please them or prove yourself to someone else. And the other one is expectations of outcome that creates this outcome pressure or economic pressure. And you're focusing on the future, the outcome, which you can't control because no one can control the future. Once you realise that, pressure doesn't actually exist as a construct in the mind unless you're focusing on something you can't control but want you to control it. Right? And I guarantee you'll feel pressure. But we're getting so far out of our lane at the moment as humans. So the quickest way to remove pressure from your life is to reframe what is expected of you and what isn't expected of you. Right? So if Ash and I came on this podcast going, it's got to be great, we have to be fantastic, we have to be articulate, we have to be intelligent, and we're caring what people think about us, we'll be totally distracted and being careful about what we say. But the only expectation of us and you, to be frank, Josh, is just to bring the best version of us, to be authentic in the moment. Right, because that's the only thing we can control. Right, we can't control the outcome. We can't control what someone else says. We can't control pandemics, government regulations, competitors, and so forth. So,
but you can control how you respond to all that stuff.
Totally, yeah.
In fact, the first thing you asked me, one of the first things when we sat down before we hit go was, "What's your goal for today's chat?" And I really don't have one. We've got a bit of a sort of a vessel for a theme, but I don't have any goals. I've got two of the greatest men I know around a table, and we're going to have one of the, an amazing discussion. I know that, and so I certainly don't have any any pressures or expectations on you guys.
But if it's one word, Josh, just to finish on this note, in case we don't bring it up again, if it was one word that I'd love to, I can't strip it out of the Oxford Dictionary because it's in there, but reframe the definition of it is that word expectations. Because I used to say it's killing the world in a performance sense, which it is. It's now killing the world in a suicide sense. Because I can't live up to the expectations of my parents or my school or my society, and I think I have to. These imaginary, unrealistic things. And that's what I mean, we're getting so far out of our lane. It's now the number one deathbed regret all over the world, is I wish I'd lived a life true to myself and had the courage to be me rather than the expectations of others. So even on our freaking deathbed, we're still getting distracted by the expectations of others. And I think that's the great tragedy of our times, to be frank.
Yeah, I mean, perfectionism has been one of, before we hit all this other stuff, it's been one of my great barriers in life, just wanting to be so good at my craft and never feeling like there's that Kaizen theory of wanting to be, at 1% better, but you can love that perfectionist side of you because you go, hey, thank you for giving me this motivation to improve all the time. But also that part of you that just has part of me, me that has had such high expectations on myself and so disappointed when I don't reach them and so frustrated at myself and not taking into account, things like injury or fatigue or repetition with what I do out there, or just having a shitty day or whatever, just like these unhealthy expectations and standards. And therefore, with that expectation I've just put pressure on myself. It's not external. It's an internal dialogue and an intrinsic pressure that I put on myself to reach an expectation that I'm basically going, hey, can you be the AI of music theatre, Josh? Can you just be a robot version of it that can just do, and it just didn't serve me. And we've chatted about that many times over the years. For those listening, Ben's coached me for the last 4 years. So Ash has coached me for longer in some ways. And anyway, that's why you guys are here, because as I said at the start, you guys have just been so instrumental in my journey and in so many people's journeys. And many of them have gone on a hero's journey. I certainly have. You guys have. So in your own way, guys, I'll start with you, Ash, because you get to speak much. Describe Joseph Campbell's hero's journey and why it's a profound tool for making sense of our life and our life experience, and maybe why there's parts of it you might not like.
Look, sure. I have to begin by just saying thanks for having me on here, and just echoing some of Ben's words there. I hadn't met you before, Ben, and this is a great opportunity to kind of lean in because I've heard so much about you. I've watched a lot of the stuff that you've done and listened, and to be here with you, Josh. I have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and jump on a plane from Byron Bay to hang out with you and also to meet Ben.
Ash did.
Yeah. Is totally worth it. So already just listening to you now, and I'm holding on to that question, Josh. I'll get there.
Oh,
but
I know, of course.
Even that talk about expectation and perfection, already my mind's just that was lovely what you said there, and I am going to pull on that thread just a tiny bit more if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Because to me, you talked about the inner expectation as well, and Ben, you were talking about the expectation of others. But I wonder, when you drop in and listen to that inner voice of expectation, is it coming in your voice or is it still coming from the voice of others? You're just hearing it internally. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when you do take off the mask properly and really listen to yourself, for me, it's just normally a little boy that's just going, "Hey, well done, mate. Well done. It's all good." Yeah, and
100%.
And it's actually always more often than not in a small voice.
100%, and it's sometimes called the small voice.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So it's like not, and you talk about that. That's actually the bigger person. That, like, if I talk about the small person being the ego and the bigger person being the awareness or the soul or whatever behind that ego, it's still interesting that it always comes in a small voice. It's this little meeker version of myself that's in a corner going, "Hey, it's okay. It's okay. Like you, just as you are, is okay." And there's all this other noise, and that is the amalgamation of pressures from parents, pressures from directors, pressures from producers, pressures from some teacher I had back in the day, like all their voices amalgamated to another voice. And I know, that's a story that I think we all carry at some point.
Yeah, look, I think so. And now we're kind of entering into, what I would call soul work, because a large part of soul work is actually, being still enough to actually hear the small voice and not let it be drowned out by all these other external voices, which you're hearing internally, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then to perfection, to me, perfection is death. Perfection is the end. Our life is perfect when we take our last breath. It's a completion of a cycle. So for me, if we're aiming at perfection, we're actually headed towards our own death or a death of something, right? Because we're never going to actually arrive at perfection until that point. And so I would argue at the base of every addiction is an addiction to perfection. Which in a sense is an addiction to death. Does that make sense?
It does.
And so that's how I view perfection.
Or needing something to die to
Or needing
be
something to be completed.
Yeah, to be completed.
And, and that's essentially the end of the cycle. So if you want to be alive, you're in the dance.
Yeah.
You're not kind of aiming for the music to stop.
Yeah.
Which is the perfect place, right?
Yeah.
The crescendo.
Yeah.
Is the double click on that, therefore, to live your life celebrating imperfections of yourself and of the world, right? Because
absolutely.
That's where the humor is. That's where the stories are. That's where the tears are.
Yeah.
It's where the depth is,
100%. And, getting into our own lives, like I grew up being I'm a Virgo, so there's a start. I was addicted to perfection in many, many ways. I had body dysmorphia. I had all sorts of things going on. There are many reasons for that. But when I started to do the work, one of my mantras was imperfection is my ally. And this idea that what you just said there, Ben, this idea of kind of being in the dance and that making mistakes is actually my highest form, really. Yeah. If I'm not making mistakes then something's wrong a little, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Classic wabi-sabi.
The wabi-sabi, absolutely. That's exactly it. So onto the hero's journey, I guess.
What a great prologue though, and I'm a music theatre fan, love a good prologue. How do we, Les Mis doesn't start until at the end of the day, you're another day older. But there's that prologue that goes for 20 minutes. It goes, oh, now we're in.
Yeah.
So if you're listening to this now and you're not hooked in on these two wise owls.
And please feel free to go in a Les Mis character too, Josh, on this.
Absolutely.
You were there for
absolutely.
it, mate.
But you know what they say, and I'm going to go slightly off again, but there's a certain understanding that if you don't ritualize the space, no one learns anything. Yeah. And ritualizing the space essentially means heating it up. It's why there might be drums or, the prologue.
Yep.
And I feel like maybe that conversation has kind of heated the space up. So now we can go and learn something. That's right.
I fucking love that. That is great. You've got to ritualize the space. We've talked about that a bit on, behind the scenes of Behind the Mask, of how we decompress afterwards. People share some really vulnerable things on this show. And so it's like, well, how do we just have a moment afterwards to sort of a barrier between what's been said in this sacred space that's now public to going into the outside world? And, you can liken it to many things. I liken it to stepping out of a hardcore workout with all that endorphins and your bloody pumping, and then just going out and going, oh yeah, but I've got to step on the freeway now and drive at 100 kilometers an hour. I'm like, you just need a bit of breath, a bit of something calming. But beforehand, ritualizing the space, how have I not done that with the amount of ritual, we've shared together, Asher. So I love that you've heated up. You both have heated up this space.
And that's what, that's what the burning of the sage or the playing of the drums, it's all literally a heating in those cases, like rubbing the drum skin a little before you hit it and heating the space up. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Totally.
So,
the hero's journey. Yeah. Well, look, from my point of view, very basically, just to kind of kick things up, it's the arc of one's life, isn't it? And Joseph Campbell came up with the hero's journey in the 50s, and it was the idea of the monomyth. He looked around the world at all the different ancient cultures and all the different stories that were coming through. He saw a common thread and a common cycle, where the hero goes out into the world and all these things happen, and then he arrives home again. And I've just found when working with people, it's just such a wonderful foundation because we can all find ourselves in the hero's journey. It's sort of fill in the blanks to your particular flavor of your life, but it's all going to walk that hero's journey path. And it also gives you a really terrific way of actually speaking into life without actually having to personalize it for the person themselves, so they can kind of go deeper without feeling, their own particular trauma or their own particular, and so they actually end up going a lot deeper.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that if you can talk about something in a more vanilla way, you kind of find yourself going a lot deeper. Like if I say, well, what happened in your childhood? But if I can frame it through the lens of the hero's journey, you'll find that the conversation just naturally goes there because the person doesn't feel as if they're speaking directly to them. Does that make sense? Yep. But yeah, I've just found it, over the last 15 years or so, such in this particular work, such a wonderful foundation. And I'm not saying it's perfect. Perfection is death, remember? So, and maybe that'll come up in terms of where I see not so much drawbacks, but just limitations. Like I think we have to remember that, Joseph Campbell was around in the 50s. And I was talking to Josh before we kind of hit record, I guess, this idea that, and it's a Jungian depth idea that we have both the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths which we live in. And we have to, in the spirit of the times, we have to understand that this was Joseph Campbell's work was in the 50s, and it was a very different time than we live in now. Yeah,
men were very different. The expectations of men, or the idea around manhood, was very different.
And
what we call and the hero. But we sort of discussed it like what we'd call misogyny now 7 years on was normalcy.
Yeah, well, that's right. And there are other, I mean, maybe we shouldn't get into those things until we sort of teased out what the hero's journey is a little bit more, but I'd definitely like to circle back to it at some point.
Yeah, we will.
But the idea of the spirit of the depths, just to complete the thought, is that's the timeless wisdom. That's the always true, that's the soul wisdom, if you want. And so that's going to apply to this, forevermore. But we have to kind of dance with the ups and downs of the spirit of the times. And 2024 is a very, very different place to 1950 in many ways. Yeah. So that's not a flaw. It's just this mixture of the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths.
What about for you, Ben?
Yeah, I find the hero's journey is just this beautiful framework for making sense of your own life. And it's a framework, right? And I first came across it at Nike. We use the hero's journey a lot from the storytelling, the against the odds romance of our athletes coming from, could be Tiger Woods from where he started, and there were courses when he became pro that he wasn't allowed to play in because of the colour of his skin and so forth. So it was a beautiful arc, but when I started working with Nike athletes, I also realised it was a beautiful framework to help them to make sense of their own story. And we try and simplify complexity, and there might be 12 steps that Joseph might have started with. I kind of simplified them into three chapters of your life. And chapter 1 of the hero's journey, it's all about you. You go out in the world and you win a race, you get a blue ribbon, you work hard at your grades, you get a gold star, you go to university, you get a job, you get paid more, you get promoted more. We get recognised for achievement in chapter 1, and it makes us kind of feel significant, but it's effectively all about you. Then you go out into the world, and then life gets tricky. Life gets difficult. There might be good moments and bad moments, but there are always these crucible moments. And we need to make sense of these crucible moments because they're either going to hold us back, kind of bitter and twisted in denial and almost like a form of post-traumatic stress, or they can actually project you forward in this kind of post-traumatic growth. Either way, we kind of got to make sense of our life story because that will get us into chapter 3 of the hero's journey. And from my opinion, when you get into chapter 3, I think Joseph Campbell is that's where you find your bliss. That's when you move from I to we. And in my opinion, when I'm especially professionally, that's when you become an authentic leader because you move from I to we and you kind of realize that life's not about you. It's about the impact you can have on someone else's life, to care about them or to serve them or to love them or just to be interested and not interesting. And I find that when someone gets in a chapter 3 and they unlock their purpose mindset, that's where they unlock their sense of fulfillment or contribution, beyond themselves. But for so many of us, we get stuck in chapter 2. And there's typically 5 hero hazards that keep us stuck. One is the imposter. We've all heard of imposter syndrome. There's constant believing that you're not worthy of this relationship or this promotion or this role or whatever it is. So making sense of your story and reframing or forgiving or accepting or letting go that not enoughness, that shame story is so important. But there's also the loner. That's the classic alpha male or typically who thinks that you have to do everything themselves and you don't ask questions. You see vulnerability as a weakness. You feel like, you act in accordance that you have to do everything yourself. So the good news is there's antidotes to all these. The antidote obviously to the imposter syndrome is to, reconcile that not enoughness and find that, that self-acceptance and self-love. For the loner, it's just to create mentors, right? To realize that no one in this world can do anything in this world on their own. We all need a team behind us, right? And you don't even have to know those mentors and they don't even have to be alive. Like my dad, who passed away when I was really young, I would always say, okay, what would my dad do in this situation? Right? Or what would Ted Lasso do in this situation? Yeah. So mentors don't have to be, such a structured way. The rationalizer, for me, is the third one. That's the classic leader who rationalizes their life away, makes excuses, is in denial, doesn't have an appetite for the truth. And for me, the antidote to that is literally establishing your core values. These verbs that hold you accountable to yourself in these tough moments. The fourth one is the glory seeker. That's the classic leader who wants to get the credit for everything, is kind of extrinsically motivated and craves recognition. The antidote to that, and you guys were just alluding to it earlier, is really connect with your intrinsic motivations. Like Kaizen is an intrinsic motivation, self-improvement and excellence, versus perfectionism is an extrinsic motivation, is caring what others think and craving their recognition. And the fifth one is the shooting star. That's the classic leader who achieves an enormous amount in a short space of time, but typically leaves a trail of carnage and destruction behind them in terms of their family and their colleagues and stuff. So integrating your life and the human being and the human doing, that's why I'm so keen to get into some of your soul work, Asher, because I think that's such lacking today in an educational sense, and obviously has become an adult as well. So, I find the hero's journey is so important because if we don't make sense of our story and all the darkness as well and those not enoughnesses, because it affects our belief system. right? People say, well, where does your belief system come from? Well, it literally comes from your hero's journey, right? Shit happens to you in life and you believe something good or bad about yourself or the world or your place in the world. And unfortunately, with our negative bias, it's more negative than positive. So going back to those moments and reframing or making sense or just applying a generous assumption to your parents. So if you felt like you weren't, you didn't get enough love or enough attention, you can go back and have this generous assumption and, okay, what's the most generous assumption I can make by why my parents did that? And you end up, you do that work, and it's hard work. It's shitty work. It's messy. It's just necessary, right, to be really vulnerable and kind of make sense of your story in these ways. But you end up doing that work, and you apply this kind of empathy and compassion to your life story. You go, you know what? They're probably doing the best job they could.
Yep.
My parents or grandparents raised, in war-torn times when vulnerability was a weakness, not a strength, because there's a war going on, right? Don't show your emotions, son. Don't cry. But unfortunately, that's become learned behaviour along the journey. And I think, absolutely everyone has a philosophy of life. We just don't realise we have one. And the one we don't realise we have has typically been shaped by our life story. So making sense of that and the depth of that and connecting with that and then applying that to how you show up in the world is just so important. And for me, to your question, Josh, the hero's journey has just been a really beautiful framework. It's not the only framework, but it's just a really nice framework to kickstart it.
And I love how you shape it in ways that I haven't heard before until I met you. Whereas, the way Joseph Campbell's sharing it might not be seen by those viewing it as so much about world about you problems, what I'm giving to the world, as opposed to it can still be seen as somewhat narcissistic in some ways. I think that a lot of it, because it's about your journey, about what your experience. I want to go back to the generous assumptions. I love that. If I had a moment in when I started doing Phantom, I'm starting the vulnerable shares before I ask you guys to take off your masks.
That's good. So it's your podcast. You go first.
Yeah, that's it.
So when I first started doing it, I got really exhausted really quick, really, really exhausted. An exhaustion that I'd never felt before, and just found it like getting out of bed was like being hit by a Mack truck. I felt like it was sort of a hungover sort of feeling. I performed many, many hundreds, thousands of times in my life, but I'd never felt this sort of level of extreme exhaustion. And sometimes I just couldn't do the show. I was so bloody tired. And then, I started getting, my voice was a bit tired as well. And I was like, what? Is it linked? I don't know. Do I have an illness? I don't know. So I went and saw an ENT. And he's like, oh, no, your voice is fine. I'm like, well, yeah, it's tired, but it feels fine, but it's tired. It's like, no, I think it's something. Look, are you open to sort of more esoteric looks at life? I'm like, yeah, of course I am. Like, yeah, I'm like, there's that part of me that's, living in the non-ordinary world, as Ash would say. And he goes, well, I want to give you the name of this woman. So I saw this woman, and her name was Jake. And she did a bit of hypno. But before she did the hypno, she asked me what the nucleus of the character was for me. And I said, oh, that's easy. Yeah, he was put on the steps of a circus at age dot because his mother took one look at his deformed face and said, I can't be a mother to that. So abandonment. He's an abandoned boy. And she goes, oh. She giggled like, oh, this is going to be an easy one. Started the hypno, and we went back really quickly to a time. I was about 6, 7 years old, so formative years. And my parents didn't come from much, but they really wanted my sister and I to have every bit of education that they didn't get to have. So they wanted to get us to private schools, and they wanted us to achieve the breadth and depth of our capacity, reach our full potentials. And they thought that by working as hard as they could and by earning enough money to send us to private schools, we'd do that. And, I feel like it's worked. I think they've had we had a great upbringing, but it was a very different upbringing to theirs. And they had to work overtime. So I'm there sitting at aftercare as a 6 or 7 year old, and everyone's left, and my parents haven't arrived yet. And 15 minutes go past, 20, half an hour, 45, and they're about an hour late. And I remember just sitting there looking out the window with the guy who worked there, whose name happened to be Guy. And just waiting and just feeling so unloved and so abandoned. And I'm in that hypno and all this is coming up and I just burst out into tears. And not like the single tear, like purging, like screaming, crying for about 10 minutes. Never once again did I experience the same fatigue. Never once again. And the generous assumption, reflectively, is my parents just worked really, really hard so that my sister and I could be afforded all the opportunities that they wouldn't. I love them for that. But as a 6 or 7-year-old boy who doesn't have the emotional intelligence to understand that, I was abandoned. And that seed of abandonment sat in me, and I was using that subconsciously to access the phantom and had no awareness of it, and it was exhausting me. And when I uncovered it and learnt about it, I could still go back and play the role in the same way, just not with the same, exhausting repercussions. So,
can I ask Asher a question on that story?
Yeah. Sure.
From your perspective, listening to that story, Asher, is that Josh's soul fighting with itself or trying to reconcile itself in terms of to get authentically connect with the character in a very real, visceral sense to make sense of it in terms of the lethargy into the energy? I'm just really curious as to, or your take from the therapist as well, Josh.
In short, yeah. I probably frame it slightly differently. For me, it's really interesting the fact that it was the inner child that came up because the connection between the soul and the inner child is very strong, if not completely in the same ballpark. And so for me, under hypnosis, and you've gone back, and that's what's come through. But I can totally understand how it resolved itself. Yeah, because the soul was heard, right?
Totally.
And it's interesting that the voice stuff was coming up because we were talking earlier about finding that small voice, right? Well, it can shout itself hoarse. Yeah, you can still not hear it, right? Totally. And in your case, it's that inner voice and that story which needed to be heard. Yeah, it's pretty fascinating.
Fascinating, but, beautiful.
Yeah, it is. It's beautiful. It really is beautiful. And it gets me thinking because I'm really caught on this idea of generous assumptions. Yeah, because that's not a term that I've heard before. It's a great term. It is. It's really great, and it actually just as a comment about what I heard you say when you were describing the hero's journey, it was lovely to hear. Like we're doing the same thing.
Yeah, totally.
But just to hear you frame it using different language, and it's actually that's really fantastic to sort of hear it almost reflected back to you, but in a completely different way.
Yeah, that's how I felt about it with Ben. That's why I say when in that opening, I talked about how I was met with this tool, but it's been framed by both of you guys in such different ways.
Yeah. I mean, the way we use it at the Fifth Direction is sort of more in keeping with that kind of archetypal and depth psychological terminology and usage. Yep. So, a lot of it comes from Douglas Gillette and Robert Moore's work with, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, but kind of going further than that. So hearing you talk about some of the archetypes that you're working with, it's the same thing. It's just different language. And we split it into three kind of chapters as well. Departure, which is also the kind of self-discovery kind of phase, but then we move into a more what I'd call initiation phase, which is really going into the depth of yourself, and really kind of getting into the mud. Yeah. And interestingly enough, Josh, that's where we meet our father, we meet our mother, but overlaying the idea of the generous assumption is exactly the work that we're doing. It's because, oftentimes we'll, blame our mum or blame our dad for something which it's actually not their role to be doing. Yeah. And so having to just flip the script on that and finding a generous assumption and another way of looking at it. Like sometimes I say, you're looking across the river at your father, but he's at some other place in the river, looking back over at you, and you're there, but you're just not quite you're not quite at the same part of the river to see each other. Yeah. And the generous assumption would say, can I widen my view so I can see where he's standing?
Totally. And I think because of that inner critic and that with just that reptilian brain with that negativity bias, we just really struggle with empathy and compassion. So I find that the power of generous assumptions is a really simple way to teach someone the power of empathy and compassion, because what happens is we judge ourselves on our intentions, but we judge everyone else on their behaviours.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Because we don't know what their intentions are, our brain tries to fill in the gaps.
And as a person growing up, the less generous assumption is just to say my needs weren't met by my parents, and just that's the end of it. And obviously people like Robert Bly, and I'm sure his name will come up a few times because he's a sort of great mentor of mine, no longer alive, as you were saying earlier, and someone I've never met. He would say the only mark of being an adult is to hate your parents in our contemporary society.
Yeah.
As a parent, I'm in touch with that emotion. I'm joking. But I think to be able to just to round it off is you simply ask yourself, let's say I'm driving to this podcast this morning and I get cut off in traffic. A guy cuts in front of me, doesn't indicate, I got a screech on the brakes. Your first impression is, you bastard, asshole, I want to kill you, right? Then you simply ask yourself, and you can teach yourself to do this instinctively, what's the most generous assumption I can make by why that person did that? And as soon as you ask yourself that question, empathy and compassion fills the space. And you go, you know what? Yeah, his wife's about to have a baby. His son's been hit by a car. He left the oven on, right? And you do that in 2 seconds, right? And we don't realize we've got that power to simply look at it, reframe the conditions by applying generous assumptions, especially to your life story in that situation. It's extraordinary how powerful it can be.
You know what? There's 2 things I want to say to that. And one is, I would argue that, enlightenment, or whatever you want to call it, is when you don't even have to make that gear change.
Yeah.
Is when that whole thing that you just described then just is happening all the time.
Yeah.
So you never get to the point where you have to have that moment of road rage.
Yeah.
Because that idea of the generous assumption is precognitive.
Totally.
It's just completely baked in.
I'm still there. My first impression was, you arsehole.
100%.
Thankfully, I've got a tool that I can use, but we're imperfect.
Well, and there we go. I was literally about to say we get back to perfection again, don't we?
Yeah.
But the other thing is I use that road rage example when I'm describing the wisdom of death. Because one way of getting there very, very quickly is understanding that you're both going to die. Understanding that in 100 years from now, you're both going to be ashes.
Yeah.
And you're going to lose everything that you ever had that was close to you. And that's the human journey. That's the human frailty. So can you see that in the other person and think, really, they cut me off in traffic? Is that so important? And then there are stages in that. There's a lovely thing I heard Eckhart Tolle say, which was like, so you get to the point where you're like, they cut me off in traffic. And I'm like, that's okay. That's okay, brother. That's okay, sister. You're probably, in a rush to get somewhere.
Totally, yeah.
You're allowed in my lane.
Yeah.
And then Eckhart Tolle goes, oh, it's your lane now, is it? You know what I mean? Like it just continues to stage up,
It's funny you should use that exact example because I'm sure one of you have talked about this before to me and I don't remember it, but I'm sure it's hit me in a way that's sat more deeply in me because I was driving up Punt Road the other month and a car went to change lanes, obviously not seeing me in their blind spot, and sort of swerved in and then swerved back out. I put on the, hit the beep, and then we both pulled up with the lights together, and they were just behind me, and I could see them like sort of gingerly, I'm going to get abused here. I'm going to get abused here, and I turned and I said, turn down the window, and she's like, so it's a woman. There's going to be that situation where a man who's just been potentially cut off by a woman, and I could feel the fear. I wasn't pissed off at all. Like, it happens. I've done it to people before. And I was just like, and she sort of slowly does it. And I go, are you okay? She goes, what? I'm like, I just want to make sure you're all right. I've done that before, and it makes you it puts you on edge, and it makes you anxious. And she goes, oh, I didn't think that's what you're going to say. And she's like, thank you. And then she's like, she sort of basically said, thank you for like not going where I thought you were going, and you've made my day. Yeah. And I go, you know what? You can flick it around so quickly. And I was aware in the conversation that I can have an impact on this person, and it's going to be a really nice experience. This person, this can make people think that not all men are bastards, and that road rage is one level of the extreme, and road love is another level of the extreme. And, I'm always like, lead with love. So she got a bit of love on that day. Yeah, she fucked up, but what? She's also a human? Like,
That's so beautiful. That's a micro moment, isn't it?
Yeah, micro moment.
I mean, we got no idea.
But it's somewhere, I'm sure we've had a conversation about with one of you about road rage.
I reckon it was Asher, not me.
Yeah, okay. So, guys, we've got to get back to the framework here. So I thought we'd use the hero's journey in. I know there's a 21 step. There's probably a 5,000 step. There's a 3-step. So I use sort of a 12-step version for unmasking your journey. So I'm going to ask you both to invite you to be courageous and vulnerable and take off your mask and go behind the hero's journeys of the lads who've shared the hero's journey with me. The pupil becomes the teacher. Yeah. So
paper, rock, scissors.
Paper, rock, scissors. So we sort of start in what I describe as sort of an ordinary world moment, where you are, what you know. It's comfortable. And I know you guys both were in corporate. When did you get that feeling? And what was that for both of you? It was Nike for you, Ben. When did you get that feeling just like, hey, or what was the call? You go, I've got to go on an adventure.
You're looking at me, so maybe I'll go first. I guess the beginning of the hero's journey is that you're living your ordinary life, and then you hear a call. I mean, for me, there are many calls, and I think it started well before I began my corporate career.
Really?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's I think there's there's plenty of call. There's just not much attending to the call
that goes
on.
Call.
Yeah. And so, I think the call begins pretty early on in life. But if you want to take it to the corporate, I mean, I don't know about you, Ben, but there was always something missing in my corporate life. There was like a gnawing in my guts that I wasn't quite living the life that I was here to live. It was there all the way through.
You were at Sony?
Towards the end, I was at Sony. I mean, the big chunk was at AOL Time Warner.
Time Warner, okay.
Yeah, and so, living in various places around the world and working in marketing as a VP. And, there was always, on the surface, maybe a bit like you at Nike. I mean, I was meeting famous people and earning lots of money and traveling around the world. And, from the outside looking in, I had the perfect gig. But inside, I was deeply unhappy. And I knew that. But honestly, it wasn't really until my world got completely turned upside down that I started to look at that. And that was, I was in Dubai and I was about to go on stage to speak at a marketing conference. And I was in my hotel room and I got a phone call from my mum and she said, Samantha, my younger sister, has committed suicide. And I just sat down on my bed and everything unraveled. And I started to really look closely at, like, the gnawing became a shout. And I couldn't get off the bed. Like a colleague of mine came in to check on me because I was late. We were supposed to have been gone. And she knew something, had happened. And she said, I've got to move you off this bed. She said, look at your legs. And my legs were blue. Like I hadn't moved that long. And so she sort of got me, anyway, that was the moment. And I remember coming back on that plane as quickly as I could back to Melbourne. And, you can imagine what was going through my mind. I didn't have many details at that point. And, that was the beginning. I can go on because there are a few more pieces to that story. But from that moment on, I started to look at, deeply what I was here for and, what I was on this planet for and who I really was.
Asher, did you go back after your sister's funeral? What happened then? Did you go back to the professional world or you took a break or?
So the first thing I did was move back to Australia. Yeah. So it was kind of like stages. Yeah. There's a couple more pieces to that puzzle which really kind of then separated me completely quite quickly from the corporate world. But at that particular point, it was a kind of beginning as opposed to just completely cutting the cord. But from that moment on, my heart wasn't in it. I knew I had to get out, but it needed to be kind of staged. Yeah. Wow. But I remember, probably one of the most profound moments actually was arriving home and knocking on my mum's door and her opening the door and seeing her face, you know, with the anguish of having lost her daughter, and I'll never forget it. Like, you know, it dropped me to my knees.
Oh, mate. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. Oh, God, that's, yeah. So in that, you've also sort of mentioned what happens often as a sort of second stage, which is this resistance to the call. Did, you know, there was a voice inside of you that had been gnawing away and then started screaming. Was there anyone who helped you on that mentor, that Dumbledore, that Obi-Wan Kenobi, that Wizard, hush up. Was there a Gandalf? Was there someone that said, hey?
I think I was searching for a mentor for a long time without even knowing it, even as a younger man. And, you know, for various reasons, I had a pretty strong, blatant distrust of men. And so I almost sort of kept them at arm's length. And then when I didn't, you know, there were a few false prophets along the way, which only served to kind of deepen my distrust, you know. But yeah, people came, for sure, you know, including my uncle, my mum's younger brother, who's just been incredible, and others. You know, there's certainly allies along the way, no doubt, for sure. Yeah, no doubt about that.
Yeah. Ben?
Wow. That's an incredibly beautiful story.
Thank you.
I just want to sit with that for a bit. Using the hero's journey, I guess, as somewhat of a framework, ever since my dad died when I was 16, I feel like I've had this itch that I can't scratch. Just trying to make sense of the world and why some people can navigate it well and some people can't, and some people can find confidence and happiness and some people don't. I was the youngest of 6 kids, and my brothers and sisters are, you know, incredible doctors and lawyers and nurses and teachers, and I think I wanted to be a wannabe of all of those and emulate my brothers and sisters, and I went down a very different path. I studied philosophy and anthropology and English, and then I joined Nike, where the itch got even bigger, seeing so many athletes going off the rails, obsessed with their extrinsic motivations, you know, money and fame and status and recognition, to the detriment of their intrinsic motivations, why they fell in love with sport in the first place.
I've never been there. I wouldn't know what that's about.
It was just extraordinary, and we did a really bad job at Nike. And a lot of these stories are more, you know, famous, and the Tiger Woods and the Lance Armstrongs of the world. We did a really, you know, probably not a great job of even understanding it ourselves, right? What was real and what was not real. You know, for that Messiah mentality, the fall's pretty great. And I noticed at Nike that athletes who went internally to make sense of all the shit, and Andre Agassi is a great example, and his book Open is quite phenomenal. He's probably the first athlete that at least I worked with who truly understood vulnerability and to take off the mask and the armor and reveal yourself. And, you know, as he said, he had more to lose than gain by writing that book. But he said, if you truly want to connect with the world, as you know with this podcast, Josh, you've got to take off your mask and armor and reveal yourself, imperfections and all. But I noticed athletes who did that work, were able to separate their self-worth from what they did and got back to who they actually were. Still had goals and dreams, but didn't determine their self-worth against those goals and dreams as well. And that just fascinated me. That it was almost performance enhancing. Not only perform better, but also to retire better and separate them from their identities, you know, these egos, how famous as we see these, you know, these celebrities. And it was at the 96 Olympics, this young comedian that we were looking after at Nike by the name of Jerry Seinfeld. He said something just as a throwaway flippant comment. He said, there's no such thing as fame school where you can learn to be famous. And that just stopped me on my tracks. And I remember thinking about that a lot. I'm probably a deep thinker. And I thought, there's also no such thing as human being school where you can learn to be a human being first and a human doing second. But it wasn't till in 1998, it was the height of the Asian crisis, and I was running Nike's Asia Pacific, you know, sports marketing division, and we laid off 150 people in one morning. And these are families with expats, with young kids who'd been at Nike for like 15, 20 years, right? I'm 27 years old. I'm too young to kind of be doing this. And it was quite a traumatic experience for me, and there was only 6 directors, but I was the only non-American. We shut the headquarters and moved everyone back to Portland, Oregon, and I couldn't decide whether, move back to the US, stay in Hong Kong, or move back to Australia because the amount of travel I was doing. My wife just had a little baby boy at the time. They might as well have been back in Australia for the amount of time I was going to see them. And I remember going to spend 2 days up at the Peak Cafe, which is the highest part of Hong Kong. I wasn't going to jump off. I was just trying to figure out what my why was, right? And I had a lot of stimulus along the way. And I remember with all these Post-it notes, I had these 4 questions that I wanted to write down to unlock my purpose. It was like, who are you? What do you do? Who do you do it for? What do they want or need, and how do they change as a consequence? I remember these 4 questions. What do? I just want to help people, help athletes mainly at the start. What do they want or need? They just want to do things better because they've been going off the rails. And how do they change as a result? Well, I kind of figured if they do things better, they'll be better for it. So in 1998, that became my purpose statement, to help athletes do things better and be better for it. I had no idea what that actually meant, right? But to this day, it's still my purpose. I quickly started working with teenagers and CEOs and coaches and so forth. I thought, maybe I need to change my purpose. And I thought, well, maybe I just need to change my definition of an athlete. And that's when I suddenly realized that anyone who competes, has fun and plays is an athlete. So just my canvas got bigger and bigger. And that's probably taken me on the journey. It was more of a hobby than a career path. And it wasn't until, Stephanie Gilmore, the professional surfer, got attacked out the front of her house by a random drug addict and smashed her skull with a hammer and broke her arm. She went off the tour, and through her family and sponsors, I started working with her and took her on these 3 chapters of, connection, purpose, and performance. And to see her kind of, she did all the heavy lifting, by the way. It was just having a mentor to kind of guide her a little bit. And then with a few other AFL coaches, and then into, I think it was Richmond Football Club in 2016 to 2017, to see them go on their journey with these frameworks, and then Ash Barty. And 2019, I took a gap year to work out what I wanted to do when I grew up, and there weren't many gaps. So I didn't grow up, but this is when I traveled the world to really understand how distracted the world is around, and just socialize these principles to see if they make sense, right? Because I don't have it all figured out. And I applied this to quite a few different cultures, and I came back, and in the end of 2019, and then the whole world took a gap year in 2020 with the pandemic, but that gave me an opportunity to go, there's maybe a bigger audience that I can reach rather than just one-on-one mentoring and to teams. And that's probably taken me on the journey now with Mojo. You're trying to simplify this mindfuckery of self-development into these really simple frameworks and processes. And it's not, everyone learns in different ways, right? And that's why I'm fascinated by Ash's work. I really want to talk about soul and death, if that's okay.
We're going to get there, because don't you worry. We're not going to have a conversation with Ash Packman without bringing up the word soul.
Totally. And it's only because
it's like going to Macca's and not getting any fries with that with the order.
I was so excited coming on today, right? Because I don't talk about those things or even understand them, to be frank. But I talk about perspective a lot, the way you see something, your attitude, something. And I feel like, to round off the hero's journey for me, Josh, in the same way that, Jason Sudeikis said that Ted Lasso is not a person, nor is it as a show, it's a vibe.
Yeah.
I feel like Mojo's not a person, and it's not a company. It's just a perspective and the way you see something or your attitude towards something. But understanding death, especially when you just said at the start of the podcast around perfection, right? That's the ultimate perspective shift about what's important and what's so not important.
Yep.
Right. And that's why, and I personally feel like I need it in my life at the moment, understanding some of these things in a more depth way. And so, yeah.
So,
I was just going to say, Josh, before you go on, it's actually perfect because, listening to Ben speak, just the practicality of your wisdom is amazing. And so for me, that's what I'm here for, so I feel like we're both in the right place. It's pretty cool, actually. I was just thinking as you were speaking then, I was thinking about the definition of athlete, in my sense. And then you kind of went there and I was like, oh, great, this is excellent. And I wanted to ask, if it's okay, Josh.
Yeah.
When were you in Hong Kong? When did you leave Hong Kong?
I moved up there in 1996.
Right.
And I came back intermittently for the 2000 Olympics.
Right.
And then came back to Australia in 2001, 2002.
Okay. So we overlapped.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, I was working for AOL Time Warner in Hong Kong from 2000. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Living in Conduit Road. And, so, there's an overlap there, which is quite beautiful.
But great. For a chapter of your life, it's fantastic, isn't it?
Really, it absolutely is. Yeah.
2 things. Firstly, how interesting would it have been if Nike decided to go with just be it, rather than just do it.
Did you pre-plan that question?
No, it just came to me then.
That's very good.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Like in terms of the human being versus human doing, an intrinsic motivator versus an extrinsic motivator. The human doing is always looking for something outside of ourselves to fill ourselves. The human being is bringing it from within and sharing it with the world. So I just feel like,
There could be a Mojo T-shirt right around the corner.
Right. Just be it. Yeah.
I'm sure there is.
What's interesting to me, just also listening to your piece there, Ben, was I was also working with celebrities in a different way at that time. So I kind of felt like I was possibly having the same kind of thoughts in my own mind about what it actually meant. And you talked about the word fame, and to me, where I landed on that is, fame is in the eye of the beholder. Fame is a vapor. Yeah. It really doesn't mean anything. It's like fame is what my perception of another.
Yeah, it's subjective.
It's completely subjective. Yeah. It's like I don't know who the most famous person on the planet right now is, but if you ask my son, he'd say his dad.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful thing, right?
So your son is intrinsically motivated. Yeah. That's a connection. Yeah. There's been a study been happening for 50 years. It's studying 13-year-old boys and girls around the world. And Australia is part of the study. It used to be, number one, used to be an intrinsic motivation to be part of a friendship group, a community, to have mates pretty much. And number 16 was to be famous. And number 17 was to be rich. And through the advent of, reality TV and social media, the rankings have all flipped. And now the number one motivation amongst 13-year-old boys and girls all over the world is to be famous, which is it's an extrinsic motivation. And if you double click on what does it mean to be famous, it means to be recognised. I want someone else to recognise me because I'm not recognising myself.
100%.
It creates this FOPO and all these other diseases.
Yeah, so we're all famous if we recognise ourselves.
Totally. And if we come back to what they're really asking is, I want to be loved.
Yeah.
And when we get to that is, well,
I want the outside world to tell me I'm enough.
Yeah. Yeah, and then we get into this not enoughness epidemic that we're in, and we just loop back to the beginnings of all of this.
Yeah.
I want to know, was there an Obi-Wan for you? Was there a mentor that said, "Hey, this stuff that you're interested in, I think you should make that your pathway, and maybe leave Nike," or was there someone that helped you, take that next step?
Probably a lot of the clients, I think.
Really?
Yeah. Maybe earlier discussions. Definitely everyone I worked with at Richmond, and then Ash Barty and a lot of these guys were saying, you've got to do this more full time. But it was probably a slow burn though, because I feel like I've been studying, whether it's theological, sociological, anthropological, philosophical and psychological principles for so long. And then, even looking at Harvard's Authentic Leadership course, which is the number one leadership course in the world, they use the hero's journey, right? They talk about the exact same things that we're talking about today. And I go, okay, if they're one of the most prestigious institutions in the world for business leaders talking about this shit, then maybe there's something in it, all of it. So, I guess I've been a sponge like both of you have been. Curiosity being one of your greatest strengths is just I've got more questions than answers, by the way. So I certainly haven't figured any of this out. But along the journey, I love reading, whether it's Joseph Campbell, whether it's Stoicism, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's Harvard's Authentic Leadership books called, I think True North was the book. I just keep learning and learning and learning, and then being blessed by having access to Esther Perel, more recent years, Brené Brown, and now more recent years, a lot of the psychologists in the US that now working with as well, Adam Grant. I love listening and observing, and then what I try and do, or what Mojo tries to do, is just simplify this complexity that a 12-year-old can learn and understand, because I feel like that's the generation we've got a chance with. My generation's too screwed up. But I feel like if we can help these young kids get away from that extrinsic motivation and create more of a focus on human being, because what happens in grade 3 all over the world, right, that's when it happens. People say it's at iPhones and social media, and there's the massive distractions there, but it actually happens in grade 3 around the world, the education system, because that's when grading is introduced. And that's when kids go from learning for learning's sake, for mastery, just playing with shapes and numbers, to they call ego orientation, because suddenly my parents are interested in my grades. Suddenly I'm not in that class anymore. I'm in that class and we're being separated. And as human beings, we're not ready to be put into this extrinsic motivation sense, this human doing element. But but we're not understanding what it means to write a to-be list before a to-do list.
Yeah.
So if we define success based on having to do something or achieve something, we'll go through our whole lives and never feel fulfilled or content or enough or that, unconditional love or just love. So it's kind of the...
I don't like the phrase unconditional love.
Yeah, because it's the same thing. I know. We've had this
redundant
chat.
word.
Yeah, redundant word.
Cool. Okay, from now on, let's not mention that in this podcast.
You can say it. That's my pushback against
No,
it.
totally. Yeah, I think it's the only... in a scientific way, because the opposite is conditional love, which is shame.
Yeah.
That not enough thing until you have that. So the ultimate... actually, I'm not going to get into that conversation. But you know what I mean? So I think the opportunity for the whole world is to get back into our lane and focus on process, not outcome. The human being, not the human doing. The person, not the persona. And this is where, so much of your work comes into that.
Yeah, 100%.
Because we don't there's no such thing as human being school where we can learn this stuff.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, we're getting so distracted by these things we can't control that creates so much anxiety in the world today. And I think from a perspective, there's just a better way to show up. So, yeah.
No, I mean, now we're getting closer into the soul territory as well, which is really interesting for me. I mean, that piece around, what happens in year 3. I would possibly argue that we're never ready for that type of learning, as opposed to maybe later down the track. Because the thing is, you're right. From that point, you're told that in order to be successful in the world, it's from the outside in, and you're basically oftentimes in fairy tales at that moment, our hero, something happens to them, like they fall asleep, like in Sleeping Beauty, or oftentimes there'll be like a pin in the neck or a pin in the tunic, and what that's signifying is a separation between head and heart.
Yeah.
Right? And then the hero's journey happens after that in order to remove the pin. That's basically how it works. And I would argue, in terms of education, using that as an example, I think once you hit year 3, the idea is learn a whole lot of stuff externally, just memorize it.
Yeah.
And there'll be a test at the end. And your worth is based on how much you can regurgitate. So it's like learn, test. The real world is test and then learn. Right? And that's the hero's journey. Mm-hmm. You'll be tested and you'll learn. So it's literally opposite from the way it should be. And it's really pertinent for me because my son's in year 4. And, as much as I kind of feel the resistance against that, I can see that that's happening to him already, that the pin is being inserted in the neck. He's just done his NAPLAN tests and all the things, and I'm just kind of watching it happen. And that's our culture.
Yeah.
And I can do my bit, absolutely. But, what he does at school is largely out of my control.
Yeah, and that's a few things on that. Firstly, I feel like that's the intersection between what you describe as an ordinary and the non-ordinary. And that the ordinary world, or the world of this system that we live in, we have to prescribe by that. We've got to pay taxes, and we've got to put food on the table, and we've got to be educated to some degree, and this is where we're living. But to have a father who's then going to teach him the non-ordinary, going to teach him about test, learn, it gives him this balance where he can dance between the non-ordinary and the ordinary and live in the intersection.
Yeah, but also not go too far the other way. And there's a lot to be said about that. Like if he's only getting non-ordinary at home, it's also a problem. You get a very ungrounded human being.
Like having one foot in either world.
It's like the word on his... So the idea of the word weird, it's a Welsh word, W-Y-R-R-D. And it basically means 1 foot in each.
No way.
So the idea of someone who's weird is someone who's got a foot in the ordinary, a foot in the non-ordinary, which is essentially the terminology that one might use for an elder, or a mentor who comes along in your life, and they're able to be the bridge for you between those two things, so you can have a foot in each camp, right?
Love that.
So if someone says to you, "You're weird," you're like, that is the highest blessing, because they're saying you have that place in culture of it's almost shamanic, in a way, where you're able to be that bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, the ordinary and the non-ordinary, whatever it is that this polar situation, they're able to create a bridge across.
I think it's so important because also it's really important to note, Josh, that extrinsic motivations aren't bad.
Yeah, of course.
You need money to live. You need a house to live under.
Yep.
It's when they become getting that balance, 1 foot in a camp, to the exclusion or the detriment of your intrinsic motivations and what really lights you up.
Yeah, or the definition of your self-worth.
Yes,
Yeah.
correct. And at the moment, I think today we are going after our extrinsic motivations as a substitute
Yes.
for those things, whether it's money or fame or materialism or corporate status or social status, right? This craving for these external things I'm not going to do the work.
Yeah.
So I'll just go after what I want as a substitute for working out who we are.
Yeah.
And it never works.
The when and if theory.
Yeah.
It
totally,
never works.
Yeah. When I get that, if I like.
Well, and you never will. But here's the thing,
Well, you get it, but you get a little stare and you're like, oh, I'm juiced up. Oh,
Yeah.
God, that Merc. Oh, God,
you
good
want-
juice. And then
you want
2
more
weeks later,
juice
you're like,
next
yeah,
time.
God,
Yeah.
Tesla. Oh,
Yeah.
Thank you, Elon. I'm so juiced now.
Yeah.
But you never juiced enough. So
No, that's right. And we started this by talking about the spirit of the times and the spirit and the depths. That's also the things on either side. Extrinsic, intrinsic. Like it's almost like exhale, inhale. Like we have to be in the middle of those things always, and that's life.
Yeah.
I think one of the mistakes we're making getting back into the soul territory here in our linear view of the world, where we think our life is beginning, middle, and end, which it isn't. It's a cycle, as per the hero's journey. That we think that life and death are opposites, and they're not. We think. And I think that informs a lot of this intrinsic conversation, the idea that my worldview is that life and death are opposites.
And what are the opposites?
Well, birth is the opposite of death, and life contains both.
Yeah.
And the arc of your life is once again being in the middle. It's the dance between your birth and your death, right? Which is the place in between intrinsic and extrinsic where we need to be. Yep. Both are valid. And even in the spiritual journey that we see in our culture today, too many people are not grounded.
Yeah.
And that's where the soul comes in, because the soul is very grounding.
Yeah.
It's inward and down as opposed to the spiritual journey, which is inward, up and out, which is very valid, but you want to be sure that you have deep roots.
Yeah.
Or else you're just going to completely lose yourself. And, I go off to Peru and do an ayahuasca journey, and then I come back and I'm just, I'm lost, because I don't have those deep roots.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with doing that, but the spiritual journey comes later.
Yeah.
You got to do the soul journey first, which is hard, because it's in and down into the shit and into the roots of your life. It's that second chapter that you're talking about, and I like to say, you got to learn to swim in the dirt before you walk on the water.
Yeah.
So beautiful.
Such a good.
Actually, is there a reason why we don't, in terms of our generation, our society today? Is it for fear of feeling that we're not enough and therefore I'm going to keep the mask on?
Yeah.
Because I'm shit scared what I might find if I do the digging.
Look, there's so many ways I can answer that question, but, we live in, let's call it a traumadelic culture, don't we? We're all about our traumas, and by no means am I downplaying anybody's experience. It's absolutely valid. But having said that, we tend to get caught in chapter 2.
Yeah, it becomes this barrier.
We end up just dragging it through into chapter 3 like a big heavy bag of rocks over our shoulder. It's not meant to be. It's meant to actually be the opening for you into your own wounds so that you can recover your genius. But then you're light. You're not heavy.
Yeah, because the wound is the place where the light enters.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Let's bring in our boy, Leonard Cohen.
The crack.
Exactly.
And Rumi.
And Rumi, of course. Yeah, that's exactly
you guys
right.
have read so much more Rumi than I.
But, I would argue again, and this again speaks to how we see spirit, that enlightenment is not about being light. I would suggest that enlightenment from the soul's perspective is the ability to carry heavy burdens lightly.
Yeah.
And that's the soul path.
See, I told you it was mind-blowing. Absolutely just infinite wisdom. We're halfway through the hero's journey, and I look forward to you coming back next week to hear the second half.